Good evening. In Chapter 8, we revisited the issue first raised in Chapter 1 about the rapidly increasing rate of human population growth. However, in Chapter 8, we also observed the fact that this rate of population growth is not evenly distributed across the entire globe, and that in fact more than 80% of that increase is occurring in what we call developing countries, those that are economically struggling. And that very little of that population growth in the developed countries, such as the US and Europe and Australia, very little of that growth is occurring in those developed countries, which then begs the interesting question of whether or not there's any relationship between how much population growth occurs and whether or not it's related to the economic health and well-being of the country in which it's occurring. That is the question we're going to visit in Chapter 9. At the end of Chapter 8, we discussed something called the demographic transition. This is the time between when a country has simultaneously a high birth rate and high death rate, and the time in which it develops to the point where it has simultaneously a low death rate and a low birth rate. In both of those conditions, you have very little population increase because the difference between the two is so small. However, in transiting from one to the other, you go through a period in which the difference between the death rate and the birth rate is very large. And under those circumstances, population growth remains very high. We see in this first slide a graph of the birth rate of a number of countries versus their death rate. We see that for a number of developing countries, most notably sub-Saharan Africa, Western and Southern Asia, and Latin America, that the difference between the birth rate and the death rate is quite large. And because of this, these countries are experiencing extremely high population growth rates. If we compare that to the birth rate and death rate in the developed countries in North America, Europe, and some parts of East Asia, we see the difference between these two rates is relatively small, and in fact they may have actually crossed in Europe. As a result of the very small differences between these numbers in the developed countries, the rate of population growth is very small. The importance of that is seen a little farther down on this graph when we look at the fact of how income is being produced and used in the recent past and projected into the future. This graph down here shows something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is the ratio of those people in a population who are working and those who are non-working. For purposes of this illustration, they basically describe the non-working dependent population as anyone who's over the age of 65 or under the age of 18. What you will note is that for a number of countries, particularly those in the high-income developed countries and some of the other ones in the middle-income countries, that the dependency ratio has been going down over the last 50 years and in fact has bottomed out around the year 2010, 11, 12, essentially in the period we're at right now. However, beyond this point, we see that the dependency ratio is going up. And this is because of something we observed again in Chapter 8 when we looked at the population profiles that show that for developing countries in particular, or developed countries in particular, that the proportion of the population that is surviving into old age is increasing, is becoming greater and greater. We refer to this as the graying of the population. Because of this, we are right now in this period between 2010 and 2020 in a period in which we have the lowest ratio of dependent to non-dependent population. That is, right now we have the most number of productive individuals in these societies than we've had in the past, and that we will in the future because of people getting older. So this period between 2010 and 2020 represents what we call a demographic window of opportunity, a time when most of the world, particularly the developing countries, have more potential disposable income to deal with the issue of improving the living conditions of everyone on the planet. But this window of opportunity where we have the fewest dependent people in our world population will close in the not too distant future as the number of older dependent people begins to increase. So then, what does this mean about the opportunities that we could use during this demographic window to address the issues of poverty, disease, and other conditions that make life in developing countries not what we would want them to be? So, what, if anything, is being done to address this opportunity being afforded to us in this demographic window? Well, the major effort that's being undertaken to take advantage of this time period is being led by the United Nations and their development of something called the Millennium Development Goals, which actually were first promulgated back in the 1990s and have as an initial target date 2015. The Millennium Development Goals consist of 8 goals addressing the issues of poverty, childhood health, gender and racial equality, economic distribution, and other factors that have been found to significantly impact on the well-being and sustainability of a country. And furthermore, a number of countries have been identified and goals have been set for helping them to measure their progress toward attaining these Millennium Development Goals. In this particular illustration, we see the degree or lack thereof of progress toward these development goals. The white lines in each set represent the original condition of infant mortality amongst various countries in 1990, and the yellow line represents the goal that those countries wish to achieve by the year 2015. The intermediate blue bars represent progress that was achieved by those countries toward their goal in the year 2000 and the year 2006. If we look at these graphs, we see very starkly that the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are simultaneously the ones that were in the worst shape in 1990, and that furthermore have made perhaps the least amount of progress toward this goal. Here we are only about less than 5 years away from 2015, and the achievement or the rate of degree to which they've achieved their goal has been relatively modest. So too with a number of other developing countries in Southern Asia, Oceania, Western Asia, South and Western Asia, and some of the Caribbean countries. We see that down here in Europe, there was relatively, compared to sub-Saharan Africa, relatively small amounts of infant mortality occurring. Nevertheless, a goal was set towards which they are attempting to meet their goal. Overall, we can see that the rate of achievement of the Millennium Development Goals for developing countries has been rather modest, especially considering the point at which they started. The achievement of those goals in developed regions has also been relatively modest, but on the other hand, they were starting at a very low threshold and they had a much lower goal to attempt to achieve. What then is being done to help developing countries reach their Millennium Goals? Well, one of the biggest and most influential instruments for helping them is something called the World Bank. The World Bank, as its name implies, is a bank into which countries deposit monies and from which other countries borrow money. And this money then is used to help improve the infrastructure of a country, to help improve the living conditions of its people, and hopefully help them to meet their Millennium Goals. However, this process has come with a price. As you can see on this particular graph, over a number of years, beginning in 1970, the amount of money that developing countries have borrowed has escalated and is becoming rapidly unsustainable. Even more sadly is the fact that despite borrowing this money, many of the countries have not been able to invest it in such a way as to improve the income for their country so that they can pay back the money. And so, just like some families do, they have gotten caught in a debt and credit spiral in which the amount of money they're paying in interest on their debt constitutes more than half of the income of that country. And many of these countries have been paying on their debt for so long that they've more than paid back the original amount borrowed in interest, yet still owe the principal that they borrowed. And so in order to overcome this problem and get them out of this debt spiral, many countries have volunteered to either forgive some of the debt and or to help pay off some of that debt, including the United States. The ultimate question, of course, is whether or not improving people's lives really will bring down the fertility rate and the rate of population increase in a country and ultimately in the world. Do we have any proof that that theory will work? Well, as it turns out, we do have some proof. And one good example of that is what happened in a particular province in India known as Kerala, which happens to exist on the Arabian Sea side of the country in the south end of the tip of India. And what happened in Kerala is that the government determined and put policies in place to help bring in many of the necessary rules to improve people's lives, and many of the institutions necessary to improve people's lives. In particular, providing as much universal health care for people as possible, providing universal education to all children, and in particular females who until recently were not able to go to school because they were not valued as much as males. The elimination of the caste system, which is a social stratification system that kept different and segregated different parts of the population, constrained some people to never being able to improve themselves. And developing a more equitable land and food distribution system within the country so that more people felt empowered to do better for themselves and work hard enough to improve their circumstances. As a result, people in Kerala have significantly benefited. For one, the average age in most of India, life expectancy, is 65 years of age. In Kerala, it's 73 years of age. Infant mortality in all of India is about 57 children that do not survive out of 1,000, whereas in Kerala it's only 12 out of 1,000. There's a 90% literacy rate in the country, and most importantly, the fertility rate, that is, the number of children that a woman in Kerala will have during her lifetime, or anywhere for that matter, in India is 3.7 per woman. In Kerala, it's less than half that, 1.8. So in other words, improving people's circumstances, improving their quality of life, and giving them some hope for bettering themselves and their families does work.